Welcome, everybody. I'm Jeremy Fricke. I'm Education Director at Tri-Faith Initiative. Tonight you're here for Abraham's Whiteboard on the African American and Jewish connections in Samuel Bak Holocaust art. And Dr. Jeannette Gabriel is here with us today, and she'll be doing if you have questions, if you could please put them in the chat at first. And the preference for tonight is to return to questions at near the end. So put down your questions and we'll get to them. But thank you again, everyone, for coming. Also remember that after the event, we'll be sending out an email with the survey, with the recording and other things. So thank you again for coming, and I am happy to introduce Dr. Jeannette Gabriel. Take it away.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I appreciate you taking time out of a lovely summer evening to talk about Samuel Bak. I'll try to manage both my presentation and my notes at the same time. So let's hope that works here. Okay. All right. Is everyone seeing the presentation? Okay. Okay. And you don't see my notes, right?
Right.
Okay, cool. Always good to know that that's the case. Okay, my name is Dr. Jeannette Gabriel. I'm the director of the Schwalb Center for Israel and Jewish Studies at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, which is an amazing thing to have a Center for Israel and Jewish Studies here in the heartland. And it's because of the generosity and vision of Nate and Hannah Schwalb, who set up this center 12 years ago. And my research work is focused on Judaism in the Midwest and also interactions between the Jewish and African American communities. So tonight I get an opportunity to really dig into that second part of my research interests around the work of Samuel Bak. And for those of you who may not already know, there was an exhibit of Samuel Bak's work at UNO in 2019. And the University of Nebraska at Omaha has recently been gifted over 500 works of art by Samuel Bak. And they cover over 75 years of the artist's life. And this is part of a larger gift of the artist's estate and collected papers. This collection will form the basis of the Samuel Bak Museum and Learning Center that will be located on the UNO campus and will expand and deepen appreciation and understanding of Bak's work, focusing on scholarship, academic curricula, community engagement like this, and educational activities related to human rights, genocide studies, the Holocaust, and artistic expression. UNO has a strong presence in the area of Holocaust and genocide studies, Jewish studies, and human rights. The UNO College of Arts and Sciences is host to 3 academic research centers: the Fried Academy for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, the Goldstein Center for Human Rights, and of course, the Schwalb Center for Israel and Jewish Studies. So in 2019, there was an exhibit of Samuel Bak's work at UNO. And over 5,000 members of the public attended, including over 1,500 middle and high school students from Nebraska and Iowa. And the collaboration really created learning materials for local schools to incorporate the exhibit's themes of human rights and justice into their curricula. And this is very relevant to the presentation tonight. It's an examination of the potential that we see in the Samuel Bak Learning Center to create new connections and deepen our understanding of how Samuel Bak's Holocaust art can resonate with many different communities in different ways across time. So I want to tell you a little bit about Sam Bak. He was born in Vilna, Poland. He's now based in Weston, Massachusetts, and is represented by Boston's Pucker Gallery. He is a Holocaust survivor from Lithuania who has expressed his experiences through art for more than 7 decades. He's been actively painting. So Bak was born in 1933 in a secular Jewish family in Vilna, which was a major Jewish center in Eastern Europe. In 1920, Poland occupied Vilna, and throughout the 1920s, the population of Vilna was about 140,000, of which 1/3 were Jewish. In 1940, the region was under the control of the Soviets, and from June 41 to July 44, under Nazi control. The largest massacre of Lithuanian Jews, including Samuel Bak's grandparents and family members, took place right outside of Vilna in the Ponary Woods or Ponary Forest, where 70,000 Jews were killed. This massacre was organized by the Eisengruppen, SS paramilitary forces, death squads, and the executions were largely carried out by Lithuanian volunteers from a period of July to December of 1941. And I do want to mention, before I get any deeper into this presentation, that the presentation does contain some disturbing images. So if you feel that any of the images are going to upset you, I would urge you to take that into consideration. So this is a painting that Samuel Bak did of the Ponary Forest. It's called Under the Trees. And he painted it in after he returned to Vilna after 56 years. And this is where, of course, the mass exterminations took place. And in this painting, Under the Trees, Bak depicts a surreal scene of a floating forest. Bak is showing under this mass grave in the forest, he's showing tombstones of the rocks coming up. And of course, there are no tombstones because there was no way to document the deaths. In fact, the Nazis came back and dug up all the mass graves and burned them because they were worried about evidence of their crimes. So what Bak is depicting here is a surreal situation where the laws of nature cannot exist. This is the same approach to the world of the Holocaust as a surreal space outside the laws of man and nature that was employed by Polish Holocaust survivor and writer Yechiel Danur in his famous testimony at the Eichmann trial right before he collapsed on the witness stand. He said, "I do not see myself as a writer who writes literature. This is a chronicle from the planet Auschwitz. I was there for about 2 years. The time there is not the same as it is here on Earth. And the inhabitants of this planet had no names. They had no parents and no children. They did not wear clothes the way they wear here. They were not born there and did not give birth. They did not live according to the laws of the world here and did not die." So this is the depiction of this incredible world of brutality and extermination as a surreal space. So that brings me to probably the most iconic image of the Holocaust. This is a documentation from the Stroop report of the Warsaw Ghetto. In July of 1942, at the same time that the exterminations began in the Ponary Forest, 5,000 Jews a day were being shipped out of the Warsaw Ghetto. The ghetto held 500,000 Jews in a walled compound, and people were suffering from disease, starvation, and death, of course. In April of 1943, the final liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto began, and a small resistance group began to fight back. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, held by a very brave group of people who, of course, were all to perish as martyrs, went on until May 16th, almost a full month, when the resistance was finally crushed. Then the last 56,000 residents of the ghetto were deported, and this is a scene of that final deportation. SS Major General Eugen Stroop documented the daily killings and included dozens of photographs in an official report. The caption on this particular image was "Pulled from the bunker by force." And Stroop's report was given as a birthday gift to Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS. The Stroop report was used as evidence during the Nuremberg trials and contributed to Stroop being executed near the ghetto in 1951. The image from the report has become the most famous iconic image of the Holocaust. The child has never been identified and has come to represent the face of all the Jewish children murdered by the Nazis. There's a poem written by a Holocaust survivor, Yala Corwin, called "The Little Boy with His Hands Up." All the torments of this harassed crowd are written on your face. In your dark eyes, a vision of horror. You have seen death already on the ghetto streets, haven't you? So Samuel Bak is deeply inspired by this picture, and he creates a series of 75 paintings in the period around 2008 called Icon of Loss series, in which he examines in many different ways the Warsaw Ghetto Boy through a series of visual testimonies, highlighting the boy. And one of the reasons that he talks about that this particular subject was so very dear to his heart is that he sees it as a representation potentially of himself and his murdered best friend, Samuel Epstein. So he is sort of using this imagery as a personal representation of its struggles. Bak has talked about the boy as a poignant figure who remained detached from the crowd. So even as the crowd around him is suffering, the boy, in a sense, is alone, completely alone. Bak considers his 75 paintings in the Icons of Loss, which is what I'm going to focus on today, and his other work as a visual means of teaching the Holocaust, because the Holocaust is not a chronicle of facts, but a moral and psychological phenomena. And he is deeply intrigued with the way that young people, whether Caucasian, African American, Latino, Asian, identify with the Warsaw Boy. And he comments that for the children that he hears feedback on his paintings, the Warsaw Boy isn't a Jewish emblem, but a signal on a universal scale of the type of brutality that continues to happen throughout the world. Bak says, with his arms lifted in an attitude of resignation and surrender, and his depleted gaze focused on my eyes, he never stops questioning me. The child confronts us, interrupting the world in which we live and compelling us to acknowledge its horrors. This is one of the pieces from Bak's Icon of Loss series, Burning. Diana Popescu, in her article, Magic and the Realism in the Art and Memoir of Samuel Bak, points out that the Warsaw Ghetto Boy is an emblem of Jewish martyrdom, standing for the fate of the 500,000 children who perished in the Holocaust. And she asks, does the artist engage critically with the historical photograph by raising questions in regard to the problematic viewing of the Warsaw Boy from the point of view of the Nazi? She points out that Bak crops the image of the boy from the context of the photograph, thus symbolically liberating it from the gaze of the Nazi so that it becomes a broader symbol against oppression. In this painting, the Warsaw Excavation, this is a representation of the Warsaw Boy in the victims of the death within the ghetto itself. And a lot of Bak's work, there's a lot of deep symbolism that I could talk to you in great length here. You'll notice there are holes in the boy's hands. Bak views the Warsaw Boy as being crucified, and there are many pictures of the boy being crucified. You'll also see imagery of the Star of David throughout the paintings, but this is in the rubble, rising in the rubble, and the lack of bodies that the Jewish community had to bury, and how important this is in the Jewish religion to be able to bury the body, and the loss to the community. In this, the signal of identity, the little boy is a refugee with the refugee knapsack, all he owns in the world, on his back. The Star of David is dismantled into many different forms, and he is with his hands up facing the wall for execution. Here you see a window, and you will see many windows throughout Bak's work that are bricked over. Any capacity to escape the ghetto is walled off. This is another representation, and here you can see the Star of David. Throughout Bak's work, there's a juxtaposition of these reds and blues. Deep reds of the earth, and the blues representing the sea and Israel. Of course, there are many different interpretations by many different scholars of all these symbols. Bak, as an artist, doesn't interpret his works, he asks questions. And one of the things that's really interesting that we see here in Bak's work is that the world is in shambles. And the artist is in the process of recreating it. So you will see that there are different pieces that have been torn apart that the artist is assembling, like the piece for the boy's eyes. Now, in some paintings in the Iconoclast series, the boy has eyes, like in this one, that are gazing out. And in others, the boy is faceless, representing all the children who were lost. I wanted to show this one in particular, walled in, because the walls of the ghetto are so important throughout Bak's work. And when he was here meeting with students, I had the opportunity to hear him talking with some middle school students. And one of the girls said, "I live in a ghetto." And that led to a very interesting conversation about what is a ghetto. And Bak said, you know, a ghetto does two things. It protects people from the outside world. And of course, this was true in medieval Europe, the Jewish community being protected in walled cities from violent attacks of their Christian neighbors. And it also creates barriers that allow tremendous violence to take place within the ghetto. It's interesting to think about how this term ghetto transcends time and place and different groups, and how people identify with that word. In Against the Wall, we see just the boy's head and hands. He has no body, and yet he continues to gaze out at us. And you see the crucifixion in his hands. Who has come to save the little boy? Nobody has come to save the little boy. And Bak is asking big questions about God during the Holocaust. So now I want to shift to thinking about how the vulnerability of children within a racist system of oppression is not just about Jewish children, but has also been a theme of movements for justice throughout American history. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s is often seen as being initiated by the Supreme Court decision, Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, which ruled against school segregation. However, for many African Americans, the civil rights movement began with the murder of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy from Chicago who was murdered while visiting his aunt, uncle, and cousins in Monee, Mississippi. And this was very common for African Americans who had gone north with the Great Migration to send their children back to the South during the summer to be with relatives. According to court documents, Till purchased 2 cents worth of bubble gum from a local grocery store and said, "Bye, baby. over his shoulder to a white woman, Carolyn Bryant, as he exited the store. Carolyn Bryant testified in court that Till had grabbed her hand, and after she pulled away, he followed her behind the counter, clasped her waist, and using vulgar language told her that he had been with white women before. That night, two white men, Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam, dragged Till from his bed, beat him until he was completely disfigured, and shot him before tossing his body into the Tallahatchie River. Bryant and Millam maintained their innocence and were acquitted by an all-white, all-male jury. They later sold their story for $4,000 to Look magazine, bragging about the murder, and said that it was a form of Southern vigilante justice implemented to protect white womanhood. Carolyn Bryant confessed that she lied about the entire event much later at the age of 82. Till's mother, Mamie Till Mobley, insisted on an open casket at her son's funeral services, which was attended by more than 50,000 people and chronicled by Jet magazine. The photo of Till with his mother earlier that year, alongside Jet's photo of his mutilated corpse, transfixed and horrified the nation and became an important catalyst for the civil rights movement. Till's murder was viewed as evidence of the type of violence regularly inflicted upon African Americans in the South when they spoke out or challenged the rules of racism and white supremacy, especially for Black men who found themselves under constant threat of attack for sexual advances towards white women. Till's murder reverberated with the nation and created a powerful movement for change. The civil rights movement continued to highlight abuses against African American children who were not afforded basic rights and protections within the legal structure. In some cases, this became a strategy of the civil rights movement to highlight police brutality against children with the Children's March in Birmingham. But during the Newark Uprising in 1967, which was part of the long, hot summer of '67, where riots broke out all across the North, protests broke out in Newark after a report that an African-American cab driver, John William Smith, had been arrested for driving with a revoked license and beaten to death in police custody. This led to tremendous protests and organized calls for change with lists of demands in the city of Newark. Civil rights activists came from New York and from all over the country to join the movement for resistance, both Black and white, in Newark. And there were mass protests. Photographer Bud Lee was in Newark, along with Life reporter Dale Whitner during the riots. And Lee took several pictures of police officers engaging in physical violence against the local population. He took a picture of a police officer shooting 24-year-old William Furr, who was caught in the act of stealing a six-pack from a liquor store. And he also shot a picture of a 12-year-old boy, Joe Bass Jr., who was bleeding on the ground after stray bullets from the policeman's shotgun that killed Furr accidentally struck him. Bass survived the wounds, and his image also became an iconic image on the cover of Life magazine on July 28, 1967. I did not show the iconic image because I wanted to show you the horrified reaction from the community members in the street and the sheer brutality and indifference of the police officers. Just a put this in context, what happened on the streets of Newark, there was, as you can see, a very strong reaction from police organizations. 7,917 members of police and National Guard deployed into the streets of Newark, leading to 1,065 arrests and 26 deaths. So is this something of the past? Actually, this movement is right here in the present because the killings have not stopped. The deadly shootings of unarmed Black men and women by police officers in the United States continues, not just in periods of unrest, but in random acts. Since 2015, police officers have fatally shot at least 135 unarmed Black men and women nationwide, an NPR investigation found in 2019. NPR reviewed police, court, and other records to examine the details of the cases and found that at least 75% of the officers were white. In 2014, the killing of Michael Brown by police officers in Ferguson, Missouri, sparked a week of protests in Ferguson that formed the Black Lives Matter movement in a national structure. Now, I hesitate to say structure because just protests broke out all across the country and there was no clear coordination, but it was a national movement of protests. Since 2018, tens of thousands of people across the country have taken to the streets to protest police brutality. And it is this theme that came out of the Michael Brown killing that I want to connect to Samuel Bak's work, which is hands up, don't shoot. Let's put this in context. In a 2019 study of the risk of being killed by police force in the United States by age, race, ethnicity, and sex, conducted by Frank Edwards, Hedwig Lee, and Michael Esposito, they found that police violence is the leading cause of death for young men in the United States. Over the life course, 1 in every 1,000 Black men can be expected to be killed by police. The risk peaks between the ages of 20 and 35 for men and women of all racial and ethnic groups. But Black men and women and American, Indian, and Alaska Native men and women are significantly more likely than white women and men to be killed by police. But I want to take a step back for a moment, and because I don't want to jump from 1967 to 2014. I want to suggest that this has been an ongoing problem that has never gone away. In the early hours of February 4th, 1999, an unarmed Guyanan immigrant in New York City named Amadou Diallo was sitting on his stoop outside his house. 4 police officers in plain clothes would later claim that they mistook him for a rape suspect from 1 year earlier and shot him 41 times. The protests after Amadou Diallo's murder went on for months in New York City, with many different groups throughout the city converging on City Hall and demanding justice. The 4 officers who were part of the what is now defunct street crime unit were charged with second-degree murder and acquitted in trial. So this is not just like jumping from 1967 to the present. Having said that, I want to show some pictures of the recent protests and consider, please, how similar in many ways they are to some of the paintings that Samuel Bak created in his Icons of Lost series. This is a protest in 2014 in front of the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. Hands up, don't shoot became the theme of this movement. Whether or not Michael Brown said that to the police officers before he was shot is contested. But what is clear is that he was shot and killed unnecessarily during an arrest. And so this became a theme that resonated very, very deeply in the American consciousness about the way laws are applied, the role of vigilantism among police, and the lack of accountability in the courts. People felt they had no alternative except to take to the streets in protest. This is an image in Ferguson right after Michael Brown's death in 2014. Here you see young men with their hands up blocking the highway to try to bring attention, public attention, to what they see as a nation that doesn't care what happens to them. The hands up, don't shoot movement became so widespread that there were protests by football players, and there were protests within Congress by members of the Black Caucus. And this is a picture of some of those images. And again, hands up, don't shoot. The message here is we are acting within the law. It is the legal agents who are not. And that is the same message that the Warsaw boy forces us to confront. That the law cannot necessarily protect people from incredible brutality and even discrimination. If I have time, I'd like to show, and I don't have to show all 5 minutes of it, but this is a video that was done by a group, NASA, and it just shows some really great footage from a range of different protests that I thought would be interesting to see. If it's all right with folks, I'm just going to show about 3 minutes of it, okay? And if that's too long, I'll cut it short. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm not going to play out the whole video. I want to say a few things in conclusion of interweaving these two different themes. This painting that Samuel Bak did in his Icon of Loss series, Targeted, is a very complex image, but it really speaks in many ways to the importance of Bak's work in the present. That his paintings, this painting in 2008, is not just about the Holocaust, but about the ways that injustice operates all throughout the world, in many different societies, at many different times, and that it's not something in our past. The boy here, who's standing under the arch with the sky, the beautiful sky behind him, with the very sad eyes, has right next to him a disembodied boy with no face, and his whole body is cobbled together, and there's an attempt to reconstruct his parts. This is what Bak is doing through his art, is that these images of his past haunt him. He says that he lived with all the ghosts his whole life. His family members who were killed in the Holocaust. And there are so many ways that groups of people who have experienced genocide and trauma throughout the world are living with ghosts. And how do we repair the world? These paintings are an attempt to find paths to repair and to challenge the next generation to not escape injustices, but to confront them. That it doesn't mean that we don't care and we reject the societies in which we live, but yet that we are deeply engaged in them and care deeply about a better future. So many times as I've trained high school history teachers throughout an earlier phase of my career, the teachers would say that their children always viewed the Holocaust entirely in the past, and that they didn't feel any connection to it, and that they didn't feel really much connection to the past. And when teachers would teach the civil rights movement, the students would say, well, I wouldn't act that way. I wouldn't put up with that. Why did people put up with that at this time? It's very hard for young people to understand that historical progress is not an upward trajectory, but that we are continually spinning in the same historical problems that we confronted in the past. Sam Bak's paintings offer a tremendous opportunity to initiate those conversations and to hear the next generation's ideas, proposals, strategies for how to create a better world. We won't always agree with them, but that is the nature of a democracy where we struggle together. We try different approaches to fix the society, and we accept that we are not a perfect society, but one that needs deep change in order to achieve justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gabriel. I know the first words that come to my mind are both beautiful and terrible. I do want to invite anyone here who has any questions or any comments to add them either verbally or in the chat. Either is fine.
Well, the word that comes, to my mind is wow, and just seeing all the pictures and the art, and then the pictures. I grew up, in Detroit during the 1967 riot, so it sparked something. I was about 8 years old at the time. But, you said something powerful. Actually, your whole presentation was powerful. But you said at the end, we live in a imperfect world. Do you think those who commit these think that their world is perfect and they're trying to perfect it in their crazy mindset? Because if we live, we do live in an imperfect world. We try to make it perfect, by being passionate and tolerant and all that. But those who commit oppressive acts and genocidal acts, they live in their own mind that it may be a perfect world in their mind. What sets them off? I don't know. So I'd be happy to hear your comment on that.
It's a really challenging question. I thank you for all your comments. It's a really challenging question. Certainly, historically, people are driven by fear of the other. And competition, what is viewed as competition over limited resources. And through the process of ghettoization and marginalization, it's easy to view groups as others and strip them of their humanity. And once that's done, of course, then it's a small step to inflicting tremendous violence. And I think that's really the core of the issue, is the separation and dehumanization of groups. That's what justifies violence. I don't know if that answers the question. It was a very intense question.
It does. Thank you. It really does. It does.
I know it's sort of overwhelming. You don't have to have a question. You can just sort of comment on it. I'd love to hear what you thought.
I think it's a real question. Sorry, I'm not on the video right now. I think I can turn it on in a minute or two. But You did such a just such nice work, both kind of segueing between violence that was committed during the Holocaust and potentially genocidal violence that can be committed because of, racism of other kinds. Actually, I didn't and should have known about this before now, but there was, I'm sure you know about this, there was kind of a declaration from the 1950s, I think, called We Charge Genocide, that was developed by an African-American rights group in Chicago. So, the question about what do we mean by genocide is really interesting. But the actual question I have for you is, in some ways, I think this may be inevitable, but to talk about children and violence against children, it's so powerful, right? And sometimes I wonder whether we sort of put children apart as a class for good reason, but also in some ways to set them apart for, well, those adults. I guess this just occurred to me, so forgive me if it wanders, but when I study immigration, everybody's, sympathetic towards the poor children, but sometimes even violence against children is justified by saying, well, their parents shouldn't have done X, Y, and Z. The adults with them shouldn't have. And so, one of the issues that happens with African-American boys and girls is that they get treated as adults or viewed as adults. So I wonder if there can be sometimes a problem, although again, that's obviously not to say that, that we shouldn't focus on children's rights and violence against children, but that sometimes we can kind of separate out children and say, well, it's a problem when violence is done against children, but then we come up with all sorts of excuses for why it's essentially okay to target adults or treat certain children as adults.
I think you raise a really important point, Laura, and I appreciate you raising it. It's something that has been discussed within immigrant rights movements for a long time. It's something that was discussed within the civil rights movement in the 1960s, is that children are considered, they have potential to not be like their parents. And this is the problematic part, right? That you're kind of separating off children from their parents and saying, well, it's a moral crime, of course, to attack children. Well, isn't it a moral crime to attack people? But as you say, the children are innocent. So we don't have to deal with the question of guilt, right? And this is what we see come up in all of these cases of police brutality. Well, was there guilt? And so because we're constantly discussing potential guilt, we're not discussing overwhelming use of violence by police against civilians, because we can focus on guilt. So if we focus on children, we don't have to have that discussion. I would argue that there was this separation within the immigrant rights movement over defending people who were seeking amnesty, who were considered innocent, versus people who have previous criminal convictions, which it was more challenging to be able to defend them as innocent. So these are really complex issues and come down to what is our rubric of what sort of behavior and violence is acceptable to have inflicted on civilian populations, right? Is that sort of what you're grappling with?
Yeah, I agree. And that's, part of people don't lose their rights because they commit a crime either. Although in some cases we have adults who haven't committed a crime, but they're considered to be like more guilty than children for whatever reason, or just less sympathetic. So yeah, absolutely. I think it's something that movements, activist movements face, in the sense that you can, there are ways of getting sympathy for certain aspects of social movements that kind of jar at people a little bit, because it feels like, well, we're talking about, for instance, in immigrant rights discussions, you're talking about DACA kids and the Dreamers, and there's the kind of implication there that for some reason, like, undocumented immigrants generally don't really deserve anything or don't have rights or what have you. So yeah, exactly. I mean, in some ways an unanswerable question, but I was interested by your discussion of, yeah, children's rights and violence against children.
Even though it's unanswerable, it's a hugely important point, right? It's we can't just focus on children, and you'll notice that I tried to sort of make that transition without addressing it because it is such a big issue. I sort of skimmed over it.
I'd like to invite some of the folks that are typing in the chat also to speak up if you'd like. I see Pastor Tracy. Is there anything that you would like to add?
I didn't have my hand raised, but I had just put into the chat that those images are very haunting, to see the child on the ground and to see the hands up. And as a Black woman, it just brings certain levels of anxiety to me, because it's not if there's going to be another one, it's when someone else, another Black person, is going to get killed or become victimized through racist police brutality. Not all officers, let me send the caveat because someone will say something. I'm not saying all officers are racist that are white, but many times the ones that many Black people that I know, including I've had family and friends who've been on the receiving end of it, of police brutality, it just brings, it brings level anxiety. I wish that weren't the case when an officer pulls up behind me, but that is just the case. I resent it, but that's the world we live in. But those images really bring that and just cause anxiety.
You know, Pastor Tracy, I'm so glad you bring this up, because this is actually sort of a very big conversation. To what extent do we show images, or to what extent do we not? Because they do create trauma and anxiety. And that's been a conversation historically within both the Jewish and African American communities, you know?
Yeah.
And it's an important one to have, because there is an emotional cost to constantly showing horror.
Yeah. But it has to be shown, because I don't know if any of you have ever seen the image of Emmett Till. You know, Mamie Till's only son, who was beaten beyond human. I mean, he just looked monstrous, this cherubic faced little boy. And to live in a society now where they say, you know, the Black Lives Matter, all of that, and understanding that Black lives have just been brutalized, Black lives do not matter to white supremacists. And that needs to be relayed so everyone can understand that I have a completely different reality, and Black people have a completely different reality than those who are not Black or people of color. And it's not laying it at your feet or trying to burden you, but to make you aware of the things that we encounter and how we all have an obligation to make each other's lives better. So I commend you, Jeannette, for, even though the images are jarring, they have to be shown. Just like with the Holocaust, it has to be shown, the depravity that can be in people's hearts, but also with conversations like this, that we're able to see, have it exposed, and how we can be better and make a difference as much as we can.
Thank you. Thank you. I also see Andy Goldstein had a question. Would you be open to asking it verbally?
Sure. You know, going along with what the pastor was saying, we can't ever forget. And Samuel Bak's work enables that, as do films like this that Dr. Gabriel just shared with us. And my question is, you mentioned about the historical progress and how there's the upward trajectory. And, you know, when you think about your students pretty much wanting to focus on not the past and move forward, because the past is hard to deal with. how do you refocus them and teach them that this is so meaningful so that we don't forget? How do you bring them back there so it's a learning and a teachable moment to move forward?
Well, you know, I think contributions like Samuel Bak's paintings go a long way to doing that, because they create this really intense series of vignettes that are so engaging. I'm thinking of his painting of the teddy bears in the forest. And the teddy bears, of course, are representations of dead children. But we couldn't bring ourselves to look at the dead children, so he paints them as teddy bears, right? It's a way, what Bak does as an artist is he makes it compelling for young people to engage with history and to think about the past and to think about connections with the present. And that's why it's so exciting that we have this new Sam Bak Museum and Learning Center here. And it creates a lot of opportunities for educational techniques to engage students in many different ways with the past. And of course, all of my colleagues at UNO and UNL and Creighton, we're all trying to do this in a variety of ways, is to discuss history with young people so that they don't get mired in it. You know, I had a conversation with my students last semester about Confederate monuments. How do we deal with Confederate monuments? And a lot of it is just actually having information. When were the monuments put up? What did the monuments represent? And because there's this constant reassessment and reevaluation of the past. We can't make it go away. We can't hide it. We can't pretend like it didn't happen. This is the history of who we are as a nation. And I think that's empowering, actually, for young people to realize that it's to feel that there's a trajectory, that problems haven't been solved, and it's up to their generation, the next generations, to continue to solve them. I don't know if that's a great answer, Andy. I'm afraid it's not.
No, that
Tough question.
Focus backwards as a learning opportunity and help young people go forward. Thank you.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of a lot of people say you can't change the past, but the truth is that history is always changing itself too, right? How we examine it, the information we find, the stories we uncover are always changing, and that's kind of interesting. I see also Joan Marshall mentioned that this reminds them of shades of Native American schools. Do you want to speak any more to that?
Yeah, thanks, Joan. Of course, this is such an important topic to address with the new national investigation into the boarding schools and how many children died from widespread disease and abuse and neglect at the boarding schools. It will be such a powerful moment for this nation to do that examination and bring it to light. I think there are connections, really interesting connections. I'd like to sort of expand this out to think about how Bak's work speaks to that experience as well. I really appreciate you bringing it up.
So what I was referring to also was when you were talking, you and I think it was Amy, were talking about how people judge children differently or place more value on children. And then you said something about, you know, kind of separating them from their parents' sins or something, or being able to separate them, not talking about physically. But I immediately thought about Native American schools where they stole the children from the parents and tried to teach them the American European ways. But I also have been thinking about the sadness of how like in Bak's work, I have the feeling that he focuses on children somewhat because he lost his best friend who was a child. I don't know much about Bak's work, but I cannot stand how children are held in such importance. And by the time you're maybe 15 or 20 or 90, not so important anymore. So that's maybe a different subject, but
I think for Bak,
I thought how,
yeah, I think I mean, this is just one series of many, many, many series that he has,
oh,
right?
okay. I haven't seen his art, yeah.
And I focused on this one for this presentation. But I think for Bak, this is also about his loss of innocence, the age that he experiences the Holocaust and realizes the terrible violence and justice in the world, and that everything he knew, the vibrancy of Vilna has been shattered. You know, everything he knew in terms of living in civilization was gone. And he focuses a lot on the experience of the refugee, and people who have lost everything, who go out into the world with nothing, and how the refugee is received. And that was such a formative experience for him. And I think that theme within his paintings also deeply connects to so many people's experiences around the world today, right? Since we have such tremendous refugee populations. So I think the connection is sort of both symbolic and personal.
Thank you. I also see some questions by Ali Zimmermas. Would you like to say more about them?
Sure. I think one of my questions has kind of been answered as the conversation has been going on, but the gist of my longer question is basically, what do you think about the role of the concept of beauty, or whether there is any relevance of the concept of beauty in art that is portraying this kind of tragedy or horror?
Yeah, I think there's quite a lot to examine in Bak's art along those lines. And it will be fascinating when we have so many of his paintings together to really think about it, because he is using beauty as an artistic, I don't want to say strategy, because I'm sure that's the wrong word, that my art colleagues would really not agree with me, but in a sense, a technique to create a world that appears very beautiful, but is that beauty is juxtaposed with brutality, right? And he is sort of posing the question of, is it possible to have one without the other? So I think it's really interesting that you raised that point. It's I'd be very interested in your thoughts as you sort of look at more of Bak's work, because there's both the technique of sort of beauty as a compelling way to make really challenging things palatable, but there's also this sharp juxtaposition of beauty and violence. And he often shows the world of war butting up right against civilians, which is very interesting, that war is not something that's experienced by military troops, but war is something that is experienced by civilians. And so he'll show the sort of pastorality and beauty of the civilian world right up against the destruction of war. It's a very interesting point.
Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any comments or questions they would like to add to the presentation here?
It seems to, that the world has, forgotten, the concept of, never forget, but because every so often, things happen, genocidal things, occur. And, we often look, at it, through the specs of, our eye and not, look at it, through their eyes, and like, every year there is a genocide, happening, and it, seems to fall like on deaf ears. It speaks, a lot about, us as a society, of the world too. So, wow, your presentation really did it for me today, seriously. Yeah, so, I think, we need to, not forget, anymore, and not let things, go, or turn a blind eye to it, just because, they're not my race, or they're not my ethnicity, or they're not my, religious kin, and, things like that. So, no, thank you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate all of you coming and hanging in there for the whole presentation. You can always email me with any thoughts or comments or questions. I'm just putting my email in the chat, okay? Thank you all.
Yes, and definitely check out Pastor Tracy's link as well. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We will have the next Abraham's Whiteboard up soon, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next time. Just a reminder, please, it is very helpful to us when you take our survey. We're able to understand how what we did well and what we can do better. But thank you again. We'll send everything out soon. Have a good evening.
Good evening, everyone.